Hello. Uh, what I'd like to do today is present a reading of an essay I wrote a while ago. Uh, it was written sometime last year on the 20th of July 2021. It was a Wednesday. And it's titled The Object of Criticism is Capital. Now, one of the reasons I'm bringing this up now is because uh, presently writing my dissertation on the common grounds between literature and philosophy, and often a question that came up very poignantly for me as an undergraduate was what was the function of criticism, as in why would we require to go through a body of secondary literature when approaching supposedly primary texts by an author, and what does a critic do, and why can't we just directly read whichever novel or essay that may be in question. Now, these are valid questions and they do need to be taken up and addressed. And there's an institution, a genre of criticism that tries to compare the works of various authors, that tries to see whether there are tendencies that develop within a genre, whether there are historical moments when a certain kind of literature can no longer be written, whether there's something new that's emerging there. And they try and broach such issues. But apart from that, criticism also has a far more prosaic, a far more everyday function in interactions. And I believe my essay tries to touch upon some of those as well. Without any further introduction, the object of criticism as capital. Criticism, as is recognized in the literary establishment, tends to command a niche patronage. With the rise and privatization of the academic industry, where the difference between a discipline and a trade school withers away, the market is increasingly in a position to dictate terms to educational enterprises, which in turn cease to be public goods and become a kind of graded apprenticeship which supply factories, offices, and other establishments with skilled or unskilled labor to take up roles which the commercial establishment in question deems profitable, to advertise as tenders via bulletins, word of mouth, or other such means. This is not an essay about a class alliance, about the inking of a contractual agreement between an employer and an employee. That would be a negotiation between those two parties, in principle a private affair, one which may still hold the possibility of changes in the public sphere, either via resistance in the workplace, which may be generalized, and or the sharing of experiences among workers in discrete roles. Once criticism is relegated to either of these roles, it tends to become either a strictly in-house inquiry or something resembling the form of a workers' newspaper, etc. Now, do forgive me if the reading didn't quite make sense because of the displaced rhythm. So I'll just go through the last 2 points that I was making here, which might have been a little off key. With the rise and privatization of the academic industry, where the difference between a discipline and a trade school withers away, the market is increasingly in a position to dictate terms to educational enterprises, which in turn cease to be public goods and become a kind of graded apprenticeship which supply factories, offices, and other establishments with skilled or unskilled labor to take up roles which the commercial establishment in question deems profitable, to advertise as tenders via bulletins, word of mouth, or other such means. This is not an essay about a class alliance after the inking of a contractual agreement between an employer and an employee. That would be a negotiation between those two parties, in principle a private affair, one which may still hold the possibility of changes in the public sphere, either via resistance in the workplace, which may be generalized, and or the sharing of experiences among workers in discrete roles. Once criticism is relegated to either of these roles, it tends to become either a strictly in-house inquiry or something resembling the form of a workers' newspaper, etc. Indeed, this is an essay about the object of criticism, and without taking into account the above mentioned factors, some may find this inquiry immature. Here, I would like to remind the reader that maturity is ultimately a function of age, and when a term such as immature, itself a negation of maturity, is doled out as a response, either explicitly or implied in the stance taken by an adversary, the position which is confronted may be attempting to avoid an element in the task which we set ourselves, an element which is necessarily common, and this indeed is the beginning of any imminent critique. Were one to choose to respond to a slew of political slogans, for instance, one is, through an engagement with the demands, however minor, or complaints of a body, engaging that body in its collective dimension. This, indeed, may have been the public use of the genre of criticism to compare demands and complaints, in a sense. The following questions would be: where are such accounts gleaned from? A meeting among friends, a debate in a classroom, a political rally, a workers' inquiry, or literature which preserves a formalized body of these voices? This is a question which capital today, in an age of the ubiquity of information, requires to segregate, if only so that each respective party may be satisfied. And this, in turn, brings us back to one of the earliest questions taken up by criticism, i.e., the discernment of whether there is a politics to a form itself. Here we have to confront the question of what is a form, a question which, in the ears of a reader familiar with Plato and perhaps later developments of a plethora of structuralisms in the natural and social sciences, may sound philosophical, anachronistic even, yet without being able to tell an apple from an orange, a letter from a novel, a factory from a workshop, or indeed a friend from a foe, we can make no progress in any grasp of a given task at hand. As I mentioned earlier, and as you may be beginning to recognize, capital itself will be made to consider such discretions. But what do I mean here? I mean, wasn't the workers' movement indeed any basic humanism itself, dedicated upon the maxim that capital, at least in its form as money, is dead, and hence cannot in itself dictate terms to the living? Uh, as naive a notion as this may be, this is a criticism that I have faced up to regarding the uh, non-vitality of what capital may be. Discussion from another classroom for another day, maybe. This is correct, yet capital is nonetheless commanded, as a proprietor is at liberty to do so. In fact, this, inasmuch as it is a question of wealth in whatever form, is not a matter handled by banks or large companies alone. The workers, to reproduce their own labor power, may require to go to the market to buy groceries, for example, and here, as regarding any other situation concerning wants he may want to satisfy, will have to make a choice regarding what to purchase. In this sense, the object of criticism, whether it is in terms of its prices, its availability, or its distribution, or in terms of its build quality, taste, or some intrinsic property, is a consideration which cuts across any simplistic division between capital and labor, at least in any personified sense representing individuals. This is important to grasp. Yet, inasmuch as any customer, would have to pay for the goods procured, they would have to pay for it in a currency which is accepted by the shopkeeper, the most common of which is money. This is why it is foolhardy to consider capital, especially capital in the form of money, in whatever form, credit, bonds, etc., as dead, and to attempt to think the interests of the workers without it. Within capitalism, i.e., conditions of social organization where we work for a wage to purchase commodities to satisfy our needs, it is impossible that labor, in whatever form, not trade in capital, as at least money, leaving aside questions of machinery, land, and labor power itself, as in an exchange of favors. Having laid this ground, let us return to criticism. What does it mean to consider the object of criticism as capital? To draw from the example already laid, any commodity, even for a shopkeeper, has an exhibition value, so to speak. Its varieties assembled on the floor space attract and offer customers choices of what it is that they may want to purchase. Let's say a new pair of spectacles, for instance. Considering the relative merits and prices of one vis-a-vis the other is ultimately what determines whether a product is sold or not. Here, it is no surprise that evaluating and comparing products is an activity much indulged in. This is done in person, on the shop floor, but also online, on forums, brochures, rating agencies, and yes, today we do rate apps on Google Play. Such a discourse, inasmuch as it evaluates objects of consumption, for such is a commodity to a customer, places the commodity in a certain light. A cookie, a pen, clothes, etc. These artifacts, inasmuch as they are considered as potential purchases, are thought of in terms of the use that they may offer to a customer. A shopkeeper, in turn, would consider the margin of profit that can be made of a certain commodity. In the difference of its price of purchase from the producer to the price of sale to the customer. Another consideration for him or her would be whether the space of the floor it occupies and the price and volume of sales it commands justifies its exhibition as wares. These considerations, of course, precede the final sale itself, and before money changes hands, a use of criticism as an advertisement, for instance, by a customer to indicate taste, preference, purchasing power, and other such factors is deployed by a customer who in these acts begins to resemble the capitalist he or she is buying from. Now, I think it's important to remark here that though very often it does happen in person, increasingly you would find that this can take place via comment threads and on forums, the forms that I had mentioned earlier. And with Amazon and Flipkart basically expanding from here on, I think we can look forward to more of that in the future. Not all objects of criticism are face-to-face encounters, however. Haggling between a buyer or seller, for example. Yet I bring up this instance because when in the public domain, it communicates a rationality of choice, one which does not remain between the buyer and seller in question. Inasmuch as this is the case, the consideration of the object of criticism does not function as mere capital, but bears with it a social use in terms of justifying the criteria of a purchase, if nothing else. A reader here will notice the analogy in this example with the presentation of evidence, and it is not likely that I use the word consideration, for I do acknowledge what the institution of criticism in its various forms has stood for. So here we have, in one and the same situation, two divergent effects of criticism. One as advertisement, demonstrating taste and purchasing power, the other as a transference of a possible criteria of purchase, information which, if nothing else, is valuable to the seller vis-a-vis how the shop floor is decked. Or, to use a more contemporary example, the merchandise or itinerary on offer on a website. Yet a not strictly commercial byproduct is the possibility of using such communication to express, whether voluntary or not, preferences, criteria of purchase, including how the buyer feels about the price, to the other customers on the platform. It should be evident by now how criticism has a definitive social function. My point in reaching for examples from the shop floor and ubiquitous online platforms is not to invite some amassing populism, but to use situations which are commonly relatable so that my argument may be understood. The point of criticism is not exhausted in its positing a retroactive status contingent on the object it can take up, whether it be a commodity, an art form, a cuisine, or a relationship. It is indeed necessary for criticism to meet its vocation to historicize the relations already in place, those which are necessary for the object in question to reach the purview of the critic. Any passionate undergrad in literature would know what I speak of in the tendency of a critic to be disparaging of authorial intent. The making of a reading, however well crafted, remains a political act, and it is legitimate to take up positions which do not highlight the imaginary an author draws from, so as to focus on seemingly minor relations between characters, absences, silences, etc. The space of criticism, if it is a genre, needs to be able to hear or read what these positions have to offer and notice what is their take. Often, antagonisms here are over a question of method. The enterprise of theory, as practiced by the likes of Frederick Jameson, seek to situate disparities between schools of thought, structuralism and phenomenology, for instance, to highlight their respective historical developments and who they were responding to. Even prior to the consideration of their arguments, how they relate to other parties will tell you something about the kind of associations they seek and which they would like to restrict. Here, we are approaching a domain which perhaps could be described as the historicity of a genre, which here could be thought of as the conglomeration of milieus from which thematically similar voices emerge. I notice I use a geographical metaphor, milieus, whereas a more established sense here would be authors, perhaps representing a canon or school of thought, for example. I do this because often, particularly in the emergence of a new genre, individual authors have yet to emerge as recognized personalities. Travelogues on Lonely Planet, for instance, are rarely about the authors. The crime beat on a city page in a newspaper often draws on reports from many writers, reporters, and news bulletin agencies like the Press Trust of India. This multiplicity, I believe, highlights the importance of studying these literatures as forms for factors such as deadlines, production costs, and profitability do end up determining their mode of representation. In fact, in being able to trace the conditions of production of such narratives, we may be able to step aside from any photographic or knee jerk response to their contents and perhaps discern in the expressions used, their tone, style, point of view, biases, etc., something resembling a position, perhaps political in a strategic sense, that the form itself tends to take. Here, I would like to emphasize the importance of not mistaking such forms like the essay, novel, postcard, etc., for genres themselves, which may be representative of historical tendencies and movements. Partition literature in the subcontinent, for instance, long being a fascination of historians. Of course, the political content in these works is gleaned through their narratives, and it is here that we may see what may resemble the story of a people. However, we live in a world where belonging, association, networks are as much objects of consumption and, in fact, investment as gold or stocks. I think this is a relatively novel, not an idea, but it's something that I've not seen expressed very openly earlier. I think the first person I've seen speak about the idea of consuming a relationship would be Gard Saad, and I'd recommend that you look him up. That aside, let me continue. The work of criticism to be responsive to formal changes in narrative, which are often the product of historical phenomena, industrialization, technological changes, migrations, financial booms and busts, would need to place itself at a distance from a fixation of the story of a chosen people, which really does slide into a religious register and ceases to be elucidating in any sense which tells us about the lives these literatures represent, unless, of course, we situate them in an allegorical register, which tends to reify morals, maxims, and other such elements from narratives of the past, hence deadening itself to what Ernst Bloch once described as the darkness of the lived moment. With these concluding remarks, I think we have been able to bring to notice certain dangers in the practice of criticism and the reification of its object. This may most commonly take the form of its dehistoricization or the invisibilization of the process of production, in other words, its appearance as capital, which can no longer tell us anything about life apart from its own uh, purchasing power, I guess. I think the last couple of lines were invisibilized on this page. Hiccup in my internet connection. But that is the essay. I hope it has been able to convey something of the kind of struggles that the genre and the institution of criticism comes up against, what it has to face up to in terms of scrutiny, and some of the initial tendencies and strategies that it deploys to seek to carve a space out for itself in the market of cultural commodities and everything else that you have that you can buy. Just to read the last sentence, which was missed out. With these concluding remarks, I think we have been able to bring to notice certain dangers in the practice of criticism and the reification of its object. This may most commonly take the form of its dehistoricization or the invisibilization of the process of production, in other words, its appearance as capital, which can no longer tell us anything about life apart from its own influence and purchasing power. Yeah, I think I've even dried my throat completely. And I hope I've not bored you. I'll attach a link to the essay in the comments or no, in the description below in the video. If you have any remarks, any queries, I would welcome them as usual. And if you like what you've come across, do give me a like, maybe a share, and any suggestions as to what we could follow this up with would also be welcome. Bye bye. Good evening.